for joining us. It's telling me it's being recorded. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Mindy Pitre of St. Lawrence University from good old Canton, New York, up there. She's actually calling in from Canada, so even further than St. Lawrence. Dr. Pitre is one of the associate professors of anthropology at St. Lawrence, and is also the director of, Death in St. Lawrence County project, and is very heavily involved in research into the St. Lawrence Poorhouse, the sort of interaction of poverty and health at St. Lawrence Poorhouse, St. Lawrence County Poorhouse, I should say. But what she's going to talk to us about today is her other life, where she works as a bioarchaeologist at the Aswan Komombo, which I probably butchered, archaeological project in Aswan in Egypt. And I know there's been all sorts of cool things. I was reading something about you and scurvy or something, so I hope that's going to pop in at some point a bit. So I'd just like to bring in Dr. Pitre. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Hi, thanks everyone. Let me just share my screen for you all here. 1 second. There we go. So we got a small crowd tonight. So I guess maybe if anybody has any questions, you could just ask them as we go. Is that okay? If that way there you remember what your question is, and we can just kind of go from there. All right, so I'm just going to do a normal talk like you would expect. So thanks for the introduction. I'm kind of excited to be here as part of your Experts Next Door series. So as you know, from that brief description, the whole point of this talk is to really look at my work as part of the Aswan Komombo Archaeological Project, or ACAP. And I'll describe what that is in a couple of seconds. But this work actually takes place in the southern region of Egypt known as Nubia. And here, let me just turn off my email if that's okay, so we don't have to hear that. Here we go. Sorry about that. So this work, the ACAP basically works in the southern region of Egypt known as Nubia. And we don't usually hear much about Nubia because we always hear about Egypt. So we're going to change that narrative today, and we're going to be talking a lot about ancient Nubia. And so I'll show a map in a couple of moments about, what's happening here. Sorry, there's something going on with my computer. So I'll show a map shortly, and I'll talk briefly about what Nubia is and was, and what ACAP is actually doing there specifically. But before I start off, I kind of wanted to show you this photo because this is the photo that started my entire journey as part of the Aswan Komombo Archaeological Project. So I was contacted, what is going on here? I was contacted during my PhD. So I was at the University of Alberta in Edmonton in Canada, and I was contacted by the project director, Dr. Maria Carmela Gatto, and she sent me this photo. And at the time when I received this photo, I didn't know what I was looking at because I'd never been to Egypt. For example, my training and my contexts were for ancient Mesopotamia, so my focus was really in present-day Syria. So I got this photo and I was like, are those houses going up? Are those houses coming down? Is there something archaeological that I'm supposed to see in this photo? And then all this imposter syndrome, right? Like what am I supposed to see here? What am I missing? And at the time, all I knew was that the project needed someone who specialized in human bone to help them. And of course, that's exactly what I do. So the whole point of this talk today is for you to learn a bit more about ancient Nubia and its interactions with this massive polity known as Egypt. So you'll learn a bit about the history of both regions, Egypt and Nubia, and I'll introduce you to ACAP, or the Aswan Komombo Archaeological Project. You'll learn about the team, what our goals are in this area. And specifically, you're going to learn how I tease information from the skeleton to understand people and populations presentations in the past, and specifically in the Aswan-Komombo region. So we'll go over some of the discoveries that I've made as part of the team, and some of which have been profiled by Forbes, National Geographic. We also won Egypt's top 10 finds one year, which is kind of exciting. But before I continue on, and I should probably mention that this presentation is going to be focusing specifically on one cemetery that we've been recently working at, which is called SM14. And I'll explain exactly why it's called SM14. And we'll talk all about the things that we've been able to reveal through our work. So just a little bit of a content warning, not surprisingly, because I study human remains. If I didn't show any images of human remains, I wouldn't have a presentation to show you. So I'm going to be using images of human remains respectfully, and I'm going to be explaining what I want you to see on the images. So there'll be no extraneous skeletons as decoration on my slides. But what I've done is I've put this symbol, this warning symbol, on the slide before human remains. So if you don't feel like engaging with the images, you can, close your laptop screen for a second and come back. But yes, there definitely will be human remains in the presentation. And also, I wanted to just briefly mention my ethics statement, that all of the work that ACAP, or the Aswan-Komombo Archaeological Project, is doing in ancient Nubia, in present-day Egypt, is, has been done under the direction of Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities. So we have permission to be there as a group and a collective to excavate and study the human remains and funerary objects in the Aswan-Komombo region. And of course, myself as a biological anthropologist, I follow ethical protocols that have been developed by my association, which is the American Association of Biological Anthropologists, which is the AABA, formerly known as the AAPA, which Doug is very familiar with. So that's the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. So just wanted to put that ethics statement out there before we kind of continue on. So I've been mentioning the Aswan-Komombo region. I've been mentioning Egypt. I've been mentioning Nubia. Where are these places, and where does ACAP work? So of course, the lands that surround the Nile River are typically referred to as Egypt and the Sudan. And you're probably familiar with this map. So here, this is the continent of Africa. Here you have the Mediterranean, the Nile Delta right here. You have the Nile flowing from the south to the north into the Delta and then into the Mediterranean. And basically this section right here is referred to as Egypt, on a typical map today. And the Sudan is located right here, and then obviously recently it was divided into the Sudan and then the South Sudan. I also actually work in the Sudan, but I'm not going to be talking about my work there today. So this is your kind of typical map that you're used to seeing. And I just want to draw your attention right here to Aswan, which is basically just north of Lake Nasser. And here's the site of Nag el Kamila. So basically our entire concession, so the area where the ACAP project is able to excavate, is in this Nag el Kamila region. But historically, and then even today, depending who you talk to, the divisions of these lands were a little bit different. So I'll just draw your attention to this line right here. This is actually where Aswan is, and it's located at this area that we call the first cataract of the Nile. So this is an area of the Nile where you get some rapids, okay? So in the past, anywhere north of Aswan was referred to as Egypt, and anywhere south of Aswan was referred to as Nubia. And then each of these areas were divided into lower and upper. And it's really neat because lower is on the top and upper is below, but it's because of the way the Nile flows, and their lifeways were kind of, focused on the Nile. So because this is the beginning of the Nile here, and then it would come this way, for example, that's why this is Upper Nubia, Lower Nubia, Upper Egypt, and Lower Egypt. So I just kind of wanted to give you some context there so that you have an understanding of where I'm talking about. So of course, because Aswan, if you look in this picture right here, is located right at that borderland between Egypt and Nubia. It's an awesome place to really study interactions between the ancient Egyptians and the Nubians, because they both had really specific cultures, right? You know, ancient Egyptians had a particular pottery style, they had particular beads, they had a particular burial style, and same with Nubia. So if you're excavating at really interesting sites like this one in, you know, these sites where I'm working at in Aswan, you get to see a lot of differences that you wouldn't expect. So you'll see some graves of ancient Nubians with Egyptian pottery in a Nubian position. So we can actually study the interactions between these two groups at this location, specifically because it's the borderland between the two. So I'm just going to move this. Everybody following? Does that make sense so far? It's a really cool location. And it's a great vacation spot. If you ever go down, you can actually fly into Cairo. You can take a train down to Luxor and then down into Aswan. You can take a cruise boat down also. The planes are great too. Anyways, you should definitely check it out if you can go visit. I'm just gonna take a drink. So this is one of the only timelines that exist online where you actually have a comparison between Egyptian ancient culture and Nubian ancient culture. So unfortunately, sometimes you can't read that this says the Old Kingdom, and this says the Middle Kingdom. But at this point, it gives you a decent idea of the trajectory and the overlap between these two areas. And I'll talk about that in a second. So they definitely had their own trajectory. And I'll start with Egypt first. So around 6000 BCE, or before Common Era, this is when Egypt had its first settlers, and they kind of came in from the Nile Valley. And this kind of led into these pre-dynastic periods leading up until here. So what this means is it's before the dynasties. And then after around 3100 BC, right here, this is when Upper and Lower Egypt were unified, and then all of the dynasties start. So this is where you have, pharaohs running these individual dynasties. And, it was during this time that the pyramids were built. For example, around 3000 is when we have, language in terms of a written word, hieroglyphs. So although we know a lot of the history of ancient Egypt, what we don't know much about is the history of ancient Nubia. And I'm not going to say it's, for racist reasons, but Nubians tend to be darker, ancient Egyptians up higher on the map, if that kind of makes sense, on the globe. So there's this kind of a narrative where, you always hear about Egypt being discussed as this, colonizer, and then Nubia as being the colonized. And I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But Nubia is definitely, their history is lesser known. And the earliest occupation dates to around 5000 BCE. So this is around 1000 years after ancient Egypt. This is when African folks from what is now the Sahara began to make their way toward the Nile. And they brought with them, specific traditions, including pottery and beadwork. And archaeologists have actually named these cultures because we don't have a diary, like Dear Diary, I am the A group today. So what this means is archaeologically, by looking at pottery, beads, burial style, we've recognized that there are different individual groups in Nubia, both in the north and the south, through different time periods. So there's the A group in the north around 3400, the C group, the Kerman group, the Pangrave group. So we know that there are different archaeological groups. And again, these are differentiated based on material goods and the way they bury themselves. So not surprising, because of the proximity, the border, and they're just so close geographic wise. Egyptians and Nubians have had a really sordid past. And like I mentioned, scholars tend to frame these interactions as this kind of colonizing situation where Egyptians have colonized the Nubians. But now, as we kind of flip the narrative and think about different ways of analyzing context and archaeological situations, we know that it's a lot more complicated than this one-way street. And we know that there's periods of multicultural adjustment and transformation and borrowing and all of these things, almost like hybridization between groups, borrowing stuff across the border. So we know that contact really resulted in a lot of dramatic ideological, social, and political changes, and particularly during these periods here. So you'll notice that the Nubia kind of timeline is in brown, and then Egypt is in this green. And then here you have this period where it looks like Egypt is taken over or taken contact or colonized ancient Nubia. And this was, a really interesting period where Egypt had kind of, come in and occupied Nubia during this New Kingdom period. So at this point, this is a really significant period during ancient Egyptian and Nubian history, because it kind of sowed the seeds for this next period, which is the Napatan period. And at this point in time, you actually have Nubia ruling over ancient Egypt for 100 years. And you may have heard of the Black Pharaohs, Taharqa, for example. They almost made a movie with Taharqa. Apparently Will Smith was going to play him, they call it the first Black Pharaohs or the Black Kings. So at this point, we can see there's a lot of back and forth between these groups, and it's not exactly a situation of the colonized and the colonizer and and we definitely see that in the graves in our area where we're excavating. So although we know stuff about ancient Egypt, obviously, we know some information about Nubia. What we don't really know much about is the interactions between these groups before ancient Egypt took over and kind of occupied Nubia. We don't know much about these groups. We know a little bit about the C group, a little about the Kermans, but we basically know very little about these Pangrave peoples. And so much so that we don't even know where these Pangrave peoples came from. So the Pangrave culture has been traditionally associated with this group known as the Medjay, which are basically Eastern dwellers of the desert, of this kind of Eastern desert. So we don't even know where they came from, but we know that they exist archaeologically. So we're trying to understand a lot about them, in general. So additionally, we have a limited understanding of how these communities functioned, so how they sustained themselves, along the river, and how they interacted with ancient Egyptians. And of course, we want to know what happened before the occupation. We want to know what happened during the occupation. We want to know what happened after the occupation, and then into this period when the Nubians were actually taking over ancient Egypt. So we don't even know what sets of beliefs these folks have, and we know very little about their funeral rituals. And this is, a really important time period, especially right here before the New Kingdom period, because these folks, these, Pangrave folks may have had a hand in the eventual development of this Nubian Napatan kingdom that ruled over Egypt for over 100 years. So there are a lot of unknown questions, and these are the questions that are really driving the Aswan Komombo archaeological project. So kind of leads me into, what is ADCAP? What is the purpose? What are we doing there? So, like I said, the Aswan Komombo Archaeological Project, or ACAP, was actually formed in 2005, and it's an Italian American mission. And we have two directors, Maria Carmela Gatto and Antonio Curci. And, like I said, because of the amazing placement of Aswan right at the border between Egypt and Nubia, there's a lot we can learn from this region, right? It's a perfect place to study ancient Egypt and Nubian kind of interactions. So how do we do this? We do this through site surveys, archaeological excavations. So we look at their pottery, their beads, their artifacts, funerary contexts, burials, including the human remains. And like I said, this is important because Egyptians had all of that kind of cultural ideas. So they have their own pottery, they have their own burials, blah, blah, blah. Same with the Nubians. So then we can get into these sites and look at, well, how were they burying themselves? What were they burying themselves with? Were they in Egyptian style, Nubian style? Were they Nubian? Were they Egyptian? What's going on, right? So those are the really big questions that we have. And unfortunately, although Aswan itself is right here on the east side of the bank of the Nile, our concessions, so the area where we're allowed to excavate, is all on the west side. And what's happening is, because of tourism, the government wants to build an entire new Aswan on this side of the river. And unfortunately, there are a lot of sites there dating to, the Neolithic period up until present time. So what that means is if we don't excavate and figure all this stuff out, these sites are going to be destroyed. So we're really kind of determining a conservation strategy for the area as part of our main mission. So, as you can tell, we have multiple different sites and they're in all different locations. So Sheikh Mohammed, for example, Wadi Al Faras, etc. And I've worked a lot in Nag El Kamila, so I've worked at both of these sites. So I've excavated there, and I'm going to be talking about SM14, which is called SM14 because it's in Sheikh Mohammed. So SM14. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So here's the team. Here I am. I look really tanned, which is ridiculous. I look like I've been living around the equator. So the ACAP team includes, every type of specialist you can imagine, depending on the season, right? So if we need a pottery specialist, we will have a pottery specialist. If we have beads, whatever. So we have several archaeologists. We have folks who specialize in animal bones, so zoo archaeologists. We have pottery people, so ceramicists, rock art folks, digital technology people. We do a lot of 3D modeling. I'll show you a video a little bit later. We have bead folks, lithics, so rock folks, you name it. And we even have bone specialists. So I'm the head, bone specialist on site. So I'm referred to as a bioarchaeologist, and I'll explain that in a couple of minutes. But our team also includes Egyptian antiquities folks. So, when you go to Egypt, you can't just dig, you have to have permission. You actually have to have inspectors on the site so that you don't steal everything, not that you would, but, just to make sure. So this is a picture of the field season, the first one I took part in back in 2007. And and there's also local community in here, students from all over the world. We have Dutch folks, we have Polish folks, American folks, you name it. And then also the community and the workforce, like I was saying. So what do I do as part of ACAP? So I'm the head bioarchaeologist. And what does that mean? Well, for the last 15 years, I've been the person who's been in charge of all the biological materials recovered at the site. So this means that I study bone, teeth, soft tissues, any parasites associated with those soft tissues, hair, for example, whatever they find that's biological in nature, I do it. So I'm also, charged with their safe excavation and treatment and their subsequent analysis in our laboratory. It's basically a small house. It's not really a lab, but it's a house. And so from bone, I can tease information out and estimate parameters like sex and age and genetic ancestry or population affinity. So what groups people derive from. I can determine things like height, how tall they are. I can tell if they've suffered from traumatic injuries and disease. You're going to hear about that shortly. And through bone, I really explore the presence and experience of disease and trauma in the past. So I'm kind of like a paleoepidemiologist. I study what is upon the people in the past. So I study old school, kind of ancient public health. But I do this through an interdisciplinary lens. So I don't just use bone. I also look at material culture, so the stuff that people leave behind, and historical sources, which is, pretty important, obviously, to contextualize what you're finding. And here's just some photos of myself. This is actually the St. Lawrence County, almshouse, or the county home, they called it, or the poorhouse. This is an image of a friend of mine, Mokashfi, and myself excavating in the Sudan. So here's a human skeleton in an extended position. We had really great preservation there. We were at a site called Tombos. And here's two of my students, Ryan and Aaron. This is us excavating, kind of 19th century burials in the town of Huvelton, which is just down the road from Slough, which is kind of cool. Grab another drink. So this is the map that I've already showed you, just kind of showing you the west bank of the Nile right here, the east bank where Aswan is. And these are all the sites that we've worked at in the past. I haven't been to all of them. I can't go every season. I have a 5-year-old, so I can't just take off. I'm like, see you, honey, you know, for 3 months and just go excavate. And I also teach in, you know, between January and March. So as a result, I just, you know, I can't leave all the time. So basically, since the project's inception, ACAP and its members have been excavating sites across this area that you're seeing here. And what I really want to talk about today are these 3, well, I'm not going to talk about these 3, but I'm going to be talking about a Pangrave cemetery, and specifically SM14. So we've actually identified 3 different Pangrave cemeteries, and I'll talk about what those folks are in a couple seconds. So again, SM14 named after Sheikh Mohammed, and I recently excavated the remains back in January, right around the time the pandemic started. I went there for a couple weeks. I took my mom on vacation. I did some skeletal analysis, and then I came back. So what's cool about SM14 is that it's the most southernmost of all the 3 Pangrave cemeteries that ACAP has actually discovered, and it's among the earliest known. So this is always interesting when you have one of the earliest known Pangrave cemeteries in all of Egypt and the Sudan, because you can see the origins of the Pangrave culture. So this makes it pretty cool. So who are these Pangrave folks? I already told you they kind of date right before that New Kingdom period, before the occupation of Nubia by Egypt. And so the Pangrave peoples are basically nomadic peoples who appeared in Nubia around 1800 BCE. And the name was given to these folks by Flinders Pitre, no relation. So he's basically the father of, you know, Egyptian archaeology. And Pitre just kind of noticed that their graves, which look kind of circular, look like frying pans. So he named them the Pangrave peoples. And of course, they did not refer to themselves as the Pangrave people. So this is why we call the Pangrave folks an archaeological population, because we don't necessarily know what they would call themselves. So I wish there was a sexier reason for why they're called the Pangrave peoples, but unfortunately, it's just the fact that their graves are shaped like pans. So like I mentioned, in terms of the Pangrave peoples, where they came from, we think they might have originated from these eastern desert dwellers, the Medjay, but you know, this kind of association has recently been questioned, but we know that they were warriors and that they were used in both the Nubian and Egyptian military, right? So like I said, they construct these shallow shaped graves, and in them what they do is they put their distinct black topped pottery, which you see right here. See how it's dark black on the top and then kind of red underneath? It's just the way they fire it. So they have basically the black top pottery, they put beads, amulets, and I'll show you pictures of these kinds of things in a couple of moments. But what's really interesting and distinct about the Pangrave folks is that they have a superstructure on top of their grave, and they put this kind of mud cement layer around the grave itself, and then they put these massive rocks on top, which is highly problematic because anybody would see it on the landscape and then want to loot it. So it just so happens that a lot of the Pangraves tend to be looted. And what's also really interesting about the Pangrave folks, other than their pottery, is the fact that they use these bucrania, so these ox or cattle horned skulls, and they paint them with ochre, and then they lay them around the superstructure, which we call a tumulus, and I'll show you in a couple moments. But basically, you would have pits with these bucrania, you'd have offering places, there'd be pots, and the person would be put inside, usually in a contracted position on a particular side, wrapped in a reed mat, and there'd be beads and amulets and all these kinds of things. So this is like the classic Pangrave presentation, and it looks different from those other groups, the Kermans, the A groups, the C groups. So that's how we know that they're different archaeologically, but it might just be the same population. They just change over time. It could be an evolution. So let's start talking about SM14, this Pangrave cemetery that ACAP has been working at. And what did we actually find? So just a reminder, it's one of the earliest Pangrave sites in all of Egypt, and it consisted of two areas, so area A and B. And so far, 26 tombs have been identified from the surface since the team started working at the site. And oddly enough, some of them didn't really have tumuli or these big stone superstructures that I was talking about that are characteristic of the Pangrave people. So let's move in here. So in terms of how these graves were constructed and what they were put in both areas, in area A, the graves, the Pangraves, were dug into a sand dune and then into these Pleistocene kind of alluvial deposits. And at this point, the graves in this area were more organized compared to the next area. So basically, we have a sand dune, you dig a hole into this alluvial deposit, and you put the individual in, you put the superstructure on top as you fill it up. And then with area B, it didn't have a sand dune, but it was also dug into these kind of Pleistocene dated alluvial deposits. And see these rocks? These would have been the rocks that originally would have been around the grave. And as you're walking through the desert, you can see these depressions, right? That's kind of how you find graves. You look for depressions because you dig a hole, you put a body in, and then eventually it collapses in, and then you get these depressions. So basically, we have area A and area B. And of course, ACAP excavated in both areas. So the tumuli, when present, like I was mentioning, are placed on this kind of prepared mud ring, which would go around here, and then they would put the rocks all the way around just to kind of give you an idea. So unfortunately, because of these tumuli and because it's very visible, on the landscape, a lot of them had been heavily disturbed, so plundered in the past, and also disturbed by modern building activities. So because of this, we had to carry out a site survey where you just look on the surface. So what you do is you look for the tombs, you map them in, you also look for all the surface finds, and you map those in also. And of course, the location of each of the finds is mapped in relation to the tomb. So we found pottery, rocks, so actually processed rocks, which are called lithics, pebbles, not so much, bones, and beads. So in terms of the beads that we discovered, hundreds of them were recovered inside and outside of the tombs because they had been ransacked in the past. And then somebody just goes in, and a lot of times you'll find the skull moved away from the rest of the body, will be all in anatomical, in bodily kind of position. And the skull will be moved somewhere else because someone just, they know how these individuals are oriented. They dig in the hole, they find the necklace, they rip the necklace off. The skull kind of moves around and then they fill it back in, kind of thing. But anyway, so we have a lot of beads. They were made of stone, like here on the top left. So stone like carnelian and agate. They're also made of faience here, like on the bottom left. And faience is this human-made ceramic substance that has like quartz, alkaline salts, and some lime and some mineral-based colorants. And what's really interesting about the Pangrave folks is that they used ostrich eggshell, like you see here on the bottom right, to make beads. And also what they do is they take the inside, what's it called? Give me a second here. Mother of pearl. So they take the inside of shells like mollusks, and they take the mother of pearl part and they actually turn them into bracelet. These are called spacers. So these are diagnostic, or when you find one, you know that you have a Pangrave. So these would be strung together to make bracelet elements. So again, very diagnostic of what we're looking at here, in the Nubian graves, in the Pangraves. So just a reminder, we have area A and B of SM14, A on the left and B on the right. And I just want to talk about some of the discoveries that we've made in these areas. And again, here's area A, area B, all of the tombs. So I'm going to talk about tomb 5, and I'm going to talk about tomb 24, which is down here. Okay. But first, just a basic description of Area A. We kind of identified around 10 graves all in this area. They were excavated in 2018. They were all oval in shape. Some of them were rounded though, and this indicates that the person would have been put in a kind of contracted fetal position to make space. And a lot of these graves were empty. So we were just finding all the materials on the surface, and there's not much inside the graves, which is, you know, kind of sad, but understandable with the, you know, with the superstructure. It's just kind of a, you know, there's a flag like, come loot me, you know, in the past and the present. So what's really neat about this area is that it's also Area A, but most of the graves were empty. And a lot of, normally there's offering places and locations to put pots. These kind of areas were not really present. So this is a little different, which might make sense because it's, you know, one of the oldest sites, and maybe they haven't developed some of their normal, I guess say cultural kind of, not occurrences, but how they would normally do things. But we did find a few items like fragments of leather in this image right here. But again, most of the finds were from this surface collection here, from these graves, unfortunately. And in terms of animal remains, they were really rare, which is also weird for the Pangrave folks. We did discover shells, fish, and the bones of sheep and goats. And that being said, you know, that typical painted bucrania, those ox cattle bucrania were just not there. And really, this can't be explained in terms of looting because we've excavated other Pangrave sites and they've all been looted, and we always find the bone. People aren't looting and being like, oh, look at this, like sheep leg, you know, like that's not something that you would typically steal out of a grave. So this means that, you know, this is an earlier cemetery and they aren't, you know, as gung-ho about, you know, animals and offering places and all of these kinds of things. So Tomb 5 was one of the only semi-intact graves found in Area A, and the burial pit was elongated in comparison to all of the other graves that are more circular. And this suggests that the person would have been put in this kind of extended position like I showed you in that other image previously. So what's interesting about this fact that there's an extended grave here is that this is supposed to be something that comes later in Pangrave groups. And apparently the extended burial was something they borrowed from the ancient Egyptians. So we kind of already have, you know, something different going on here. Might be, you know, maybe they ran into an ancient Egyptian who was burying somebody and they're like, this is a great way to bury people, but it's definitely different than what we would normally expect from the Pangrave folks. And not surprising, just like all the other tombs, it was heavily looted, but we were able to collect enough of the person to put them together, and I'll show you that. But we did find, you know, fragments of leather, colored beads, matting, so the person would have been, you know, wrapped in matting, and also, like I said, the person was completely disarticulated, but there was leather right here. And, you know, you could be excavating here and you find full hairdos, right? Like I actually once found like a desiccated penis, for example. You know, like you can find on one of the other sites we were working at, and we found like, you know, a shoe, leather shoes, hair, all these kinds of things. It depends on the preservation, but because everything is so dry, it's like making, you know, it's just everything gets desiccated, and microbial action can't work to decompose some of these things that you would expect. So yeah. So I carried out the skeletal analysis of Tomb 5, the individual that we recovered from the surface and also inside the grave. And the way you do a skeletal analysis is you have to identify all the bones first. You determine what the preservation is. And for this individual, it was around 50 to 60% of the person that was recovered. So you lay them out in anatomical position. So you have a table, you put their left arm where their left arm is, their right arm where their right arm would be, as if they were lying down, as you can see here. You would identify all the ribs and put them down here, all the fingers, feet, etc. So from there, I analyzed areas of the skull. So for example, there are particular areas of the skull that are what we would call sexually dimorphic. So they're different between males and females across the spectrum. So there's particular areas like here you can look at base of the skull. So for the most part, there are robusticity differences between people who are biologically female and biologically male across the spectrum. So you can use robusticity differences to determine sex. That being said, there are also a lot of structural differences. Yeah, I know I have a pelvis in my basement. It's plastic, but there are also structural differences in the pelvis and each of the hip bones or the os coxa brought on as a result of differences in hormones, for example, and it allows for reproduction to occur, particularly in females. So there are a lot of sexually dimorphic areas we can look at there. So basically, I looked at these areas and I was able to estimate, these kind of biological parameters like sex and age. And from this, I was able to determine that this person was 25 to 30 years old and they were female, and that no cause of death was actually recognized. That being said, although there was no cause of death being recognized, and you have to remember that not everything that kills you will leave a mark on bone. So we have to work with what we have. Does that kind of make sense? So I actually noted several pathological processes on her bones. So if you look right here, this is basically both, well, here, maybe I'll pull one up. This bone right here, where both of your hip bones join and where your lumbar vertebrae end, right here, this is referred to as the sacrum. So it's like the sacred bone, and based because of its location. So that's a group of, say, 4 to 6 individual vertebral segments that are fused, and it's inverted into this triangle. And normally you have 5 individual movable vertebra here, and I teach my students about all the vertebra. So you have breakfast at 7, so there are 7 cervical vertebra. You have lunch at 12, so there are 12 thoracic vertebra, and you have dinner at 5, so there are 5 lumbar vertebra. But in this case, for this individual, you'll notice that their 5th lumbar vertebra is actually incorporated into the sacrum. So we call this a case of sacralization. So what this means is, and when you look, it's actually a little incomplete, but it's bilateral. It's on both sides. So this condition may have caused a little bit of lower back pain, and it would have, if they would have had one less movable lumbar vertebra, it would have probably led to a little instability of the spine and affected perhaps how this person walked. The exact cause of sacralization is unknown, but we know that these things do travel within families. And for my master's thesis, I actually studied developmental defects of the vertebral column and the base of the skull. So this is just kind of right up my alley. You can kind of think of the vertebral column as a big licorice, and at particular times it gets cut into pieces to make individual vertebra and individual parts, and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you end up with these blocks of bone. So they're not really fused because they were never really apart in the first place, if that makes sense. But anyways, we don't necessarily know exactly what causes it, but there are genetic and developmental kind of etiological factors. So it's basically what we call epigenetic. We don't really know what causes it in a sense. But what was really interesting about this person, if you look on the right, these are actually hand bones. So right here, there's your finger bones right here, and then the bones right here. Those are the bones of the wrist right here. And then here we actually, you can't really see because it's not important, but these bones, it's the radius and the ulna right here. So I'm looking at the wrist. What I recognized as I was doing the skeletal analysis is that there was this destructive process affecting the joints of the wrist, the ankle, for example. And so because of that, and also the feet, and this abnormal pitting, it just basically looks like a bone destruction was noted in these areas. And even a couple of the bones in the hand had actually fused. And after a differential diagnosis, I've realized that this was likely a case of early onset rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune condition in which the body's system attacks different, systems, basically, in particular, in this case, the joints, which result in swelling and pain. So the individual individual, particularly later on, maybe it would have had some, joint tenderness and some stiffness, particularly in the right hand, where the fusion was between the finger bones. So they could have had fatigue, fever, loss of appetite, all of these kinds of things. We're actually in the process of writing up this case because there's a little bit of controversy about rheumatoid arthritis in ancient Egypt. Some folks say that it doesn't exist, and this is actually a pretty clear case. All the rest of the cases were pretty problematic. So this will probably be eventually in one of the best journals in my discipline, and we're going to shove it to the guy who doesn't think rheumatoid arthritis actually occurred in ancient Egypt, which is kind of silly. But yeah. So not only do we have skeletal remains, then we need to date them. And with Egypt, unfortunately, you can't take anything out of a country. So that means you can't get radiocarbon dates, and they're just in the process of developing radiocarbon dating labs. So I can't take samples out to do stable isotope analysis to figure out, what these people were eating. I can't get radiocarbon dates. That being said, we can date the site based on pottery. And how do we do that? Because Egyptologists, people who study pottery, know every single piece of pottery, when it was used, the time it was used. They know all the fabrics that were used in particular regions at particular times. So you can actually study and look at the percentage of the different materials you have. You can find out how much of your materials were Nubian, how much of your materials were Egyptian, and you can look at the change in the materials at the sites over time. And this is not my jam. I do not study pottery. That's my research partner, Maria Carmela Gatto. But in general, we've dated this site to the 13th to the 17th dynasties, so somewhere around the Middle Kingdom to the Second Intermediate period in Egypt. So it was used for a long time, this actual, this area within SM13. So around 1803 to 1550 before Common Era. So yeah, I always laugh at the Egyptologists because they'll bring me a little piece of bone and they're like, "What can you tell us?" And I'm just like, "It's a bone, it's even just a fragment of a bone within a shaft, and there's nothing you can say." But when you bring an Egyptologist a small piece of pottery, doesn't even have to be diagnostic, meaning doesn't even have to be a rim. They could tell you exactly where that material came from. They can tell you how it was fired, almost like the temperature of the day in which it was fired. They can tell you how the pottery was used, in what context, whether it was domestic or not. So it's like they always have high hopes of what I can do. And then, because everything's looted, we end up with a lot of fragments, right? Anyways, so they have high hopes, and I always get angry because I'm like, I want you to think I can help you, but at some point, it is what it is, right? So anyways. Now for area B, and now we're getting into one of the most interesting, tombs that I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to be talking much longer, but so in area B, 15 tombs were discovered, and several which we also recently excavated. And the tombs were circular for the most part, but varied in size and shape. And it's important for us to document this because we're trying to understand the Pangrave peoples. We want to know their pottery. We want to know how they bury themselves. We want to know how big their tombs are. Do they use tumuli? Do they always put beads? Do they wrap themselves in matting, right? You need to know what the original Nubians look like, so that when you see them potentially come into contact with another group like the Egyptians, you can see where contact has altered, their funerary behaviors or something like that. But in general, the folks were laid in a contracted fetal position. And I'll just briefly talk about the animals again. Same thing, just like Area A, animal remains were very rare. Sheep and goat bones dominated, which is just typical in general. But the team did identify some fish, some birds, cattle, but not painted bucrania, but cattle bone, mollusks and crabs and snails. And again, no bucrania were recovered, unfortunately. So probably the most interesting tomb that I've actually ever seen. I mean, not in terms of burial materials, but in terms of pathology and presentation, would be Area B, Tomb 24, which I analyzed in January 2019. So it's the most spectacular. And, you know, if you're not really interested in medical history or, you know, pathology like I am, you're like, but at this point, to me, as a bioarchaeologist, is very interesting. So in Area B, again, this is the only grave that was for the most part intact, which is amazing because of this pathology, right? So we don't find much, but when we find it, it's like, whoa. And anyways, this grave itself had no tumulus, which is interesting. And you're like, well, how do you know it didn't just get taken away? Well, there's no tumulus and there's no mud kind of ring that's going around. So at this point, this is different. And what it contained, what Tomb 24 contained, was the remains of two individuals, a pregnant female, so one female lying right here, and a fetus lying right here in birthing position, if that makes any sense. So the pregnant individual was in this circle grave in a contracted position, lying on its right side with its head to the north. But you'll notice the head is actually facing the wrong way. So here's the body, the head should be facing, I mean, this is not normal. Everybody understand, like from an anatomical perspective, you can't have the head looking back. It's like a Twin Peaks episode. But basically the head should be facing this way. And this is likely another situation in which looting occurred. You know, someone reaches in, just does a little Jimmy Jangle looking for some of the good stuff around the neck, and then just kind of gets out. So at this point, the head was definitely disturbed, and the two were wrapped in a leather shroud and buried with two pottery vessels, one of which is Egyptian and one of which is Nubian, which is really interesting, and we'll talk about that in a couple of moments. And then I actually have a small 3D video. There might be, so back in the day when you would excavate, you'd have to draw everything. Okay, everything would be drawn, it had to be to scale. And now we can use a 3D photogrammetry where you can take hundreds of pictures of you know, an actual site or an area, and as long as it's GPSed in, you can lock it together and turn it into a 3D model. And then because of that, you can then take measurements from within this model, which is great. So it's this way of 3D kind of mapping a site, which is good because clearly archaeology is inherently destructive. So once you remove this stuff, it's gone forever, right? So that's why these photogrammetry methods are very awesome. So I'll just show you quickly here this little video, and I'm gonna turn the music off because it's lame for me. Could be a little faster. There's that Egyptian pot. This is all from photos. Crazy, eh? Speed it up. You can tell the person who made this was very interested in the ceramics. But it's really important to recognize the distance that the pots are, the vessels from the individual, what arm. There's the teeth, beautiful preservation. You can see the first cervical vertebra right there, all the rest of the cervicals. And then it should zoom in here in a moment. There's the feet, tibia. Here's the pelvis. You can see one hip bone right here. Now they're zooming in to look at some of the bones of the fetus itself. They're located right here. There you go. And that's after they did some cleaning. Pretty neat, eh? I like how they're able to do that with the sand. All right. Isn't it beautiful? of here for a second. All right. So now let's look at the skeletal analysis of this individual. So similar to the previous tomb, tomb 5, I carried out the analysis in 2019. This is the vacation that I went on with my mom. And, you know, you got to double up, right? So I examined the female individual first and identified all the bones present, same thing. And you can tell that there's better preservation here and we have more of the bones, right? So we're talking 90% of the individual was recovered. So I laid them out on the table after doing an inventory, so identifying all the bones, and I again examined areas of the skull, the pelvis, for example, to be able to estimate those parameters that I already talked to you about. So I was able to determine that the individual was 30 to 34 years old. And I think what was most interesting about this individual, originally my team had sent me photos of this person, and they knew that this person was, had been pregnant, and I'll talk about it in a moment, but, the fetus, I was able to determine that it was around 40 weeks, which was basically 39 weeks, which is around the time of how long a normal pregnancy would last. Mine lasted, 34 weeks personally, but anyways, so because of that, I was able to determine that, probably something happened around the time of birth, especially because of the position of the child within the pelvis of the female. So my team, they weren't bioarchaeologists, so they don't really know bone very well, but they sent me pictures of the hips themselves. So the os coxas right here, these bones that come together to make the pelvis right here. And right in the front, I noticed that there was some abnormal new bone put down there. So it was obvious something was going on there, and it looked like there was some sort of malalignment. So before going to Egypt, I did all this research. I'm like, okay, how can, an infection and malalignment in some weird way in the pelvis, cause potential death around, could it cause potential death around the time of birthing? But then once I got there, everything changed, okay? And, normally, if you take a leg bone, a femur, this bone right here, and you lay it on a table, the backs of the bone will be on the table here, and the head of the bone will be on the table flat. When I did that, the bones were completely twisted to the point where when you put the bones into the hip sockets, the acetabula, when you do that, instead of the base of the femur pointing up so that you can put your kneecaps on it, they were pointing to the side. So this person's legs were completely twisted and pointing toward the side inside their body. Does everybody understand? So it's almost like your knees came in toward your inside. So normally this patella should be right here, but instead this is completely twisted and facing this way. Same with this side. And there were no other problems in the legs. So when I arrived there, I was like, okay, this is something way more complex. And I went through what we call a differential diagnosis to figure out what kinds of pathological conditions could cause this manifestation and likely potentially lead to this person's death around the time of this, child's birth. Okay. So specifically after we did the differential diagnosis, or after I did the differential diagnosis, it seemed like this person may have experienced cerebral palsy. And we're all familiar with cerebral palsy today. But in this case, this would be a case of cerebral palsy only affecting the lower limbs and resulting in malalignment of the pelvis, potentially resulting in this new bone being developed on the hips. So maybe this would have impeded the birthing process. We're not really sure. And, as cerebral palsy is this kind of, this blanket term used to refer to a group of motor conditions that result as a result of an injury to the brain. It presents early in life, and the severity can be minimal or, with minimal impairment to the point where it's severe with several limbs being affected. And a milder case like this would have perhaps led to some postural changes and maybe some difficulties in standing and walking. And while cerebral palsy is a really common ability difference today in childhood, it's uncommon in archaeological context and is a very rare discovery. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. So this is the infant, for example. So same thing, you do a skeletal inventory, you try to identify the diagnostic bones, you put everything in anatomical position, and skeletal preservation was really good, which is difficult because when you're an archaeologist excavating, child remains, it's easy to forget pieces, but we use screens where you screen all of the dirt to look for all these little tiny pieces. And it's important to do that because when kids' bones develop, they're smaller than ours are, and there's all these little caps we call epiphyses that kind of appear at different moments of time and then fuse on and then lock in the growth. So it can be difficult to excavate. So similar to what you can do when you go for an ultrasound, you know how they take measurements of your bones when you're going for an ultrasound? We do the same thing. So we take measurements of the long bones and we put them into equations and can determine how old this individual was when they died, plus or minus a few weeks. So it was around 39 weeks old. And I couldn't determine sex because all of those sexually dimorphic features that exist only develop around puberty. So just based on looking at bone, you can't determine sex in individuals who have not gone through puberty. So at this point, no obvious pathological conditions were noted on this individual, and it appears that because of the age of this, of this fetus, it seems like they died somewhere around the time of birth. And just like the other case I was talking to you about, we're in the process of writing this one up for publication because cerebral palsy, ancient Egypt, this person clearly survived up until their 30s. Plus, they kind of have a late pregnancy. You can imagine that 30 to 34 being pregnant back then. That was kind of old. So at this point, we're writing it up, and this exact case was covered by Forbes and National Geographic, which is kind of great. So what's really interesting about this tomb is that this person was buried with beads, and a lot of beads, and not just finished beads, beads that were in various stages of development. So these are ostrich eggshell beads. So this person was buried with a big piece of ostrich eggshell, pieces of ostrich eggshell that were clearly cut to make circles to make a bead, beads that were like, we're going to put the hole there, and then beads with the hole. So of course the team has been trying to figure out, like, was this person, were they a beader? Did they make beads? Were they into bead manufacturing? This was happening in nearby locations like Elephantine Island. So at this point, these ostrich eggshell beads are really interesting because they were placed with her, to honor her in some way. And what does that mean? We're not entirely sure. And then in terms of the ceramics that were recovered, I already mentioned that it was interesting that we have on the right here this Egyptian vessel. And this one was beautifully made and worn down by years of use. And this is like they call it the marl fabric. And then on the left here, we have that classic Nubian blacktop pottery with the red and the black at the top. And this is classic Nubian nomadic style, which is just kind of beautiful. And then finally, just like area A for area B here, we were able to use the pottery and the pottery types to date the site to the mid-13th dynasty. So it wasn't used as long as the other one. So around 1803 before Common Era to around 1649 before Common Era. So Middle Kingdom kind of time. So that's basically what we have for SM14. And I'm going back in January with a couple of my students and my research partner to do some more analysis. So, I might be able to come back and tell you some more stuff that we found. But in terms of a conclusion, now we're going to come back full circle to this photo, right? Because I felt like an idiot not knowing what this was. And in retrospect, was not the best picture she could have sent. What she should have sent was this photo, where you actually see sand, you see the tumuli going around. Does everybody see that there? Here's a tumulus, here's a tumulus, here's a tumulus, here's another one. And this, in this previous picture, was actually what she was trying to show me. These buildings were in the process of being built. They weren't coming down. And this was a tumulus right here on the surface. And these are just, current modern day mud bricks, right? So anyway, she was trying to show me this pan grave, which I was not familiar with at the time. And knowing, what I know now, I definitely would have known what she was trying to show me. So anyways, I hope through this talk you become a little more familiar with the ancient Nubians, right? And, I hope that they're given this kind of place that they deserve. If you ever go to the Sudan, I mean, they have beautiful pyramids all across the region. It's unbelievable. You should really check it out. So I hope you learned a bit about ACAP and what we do, particularly at SM14, which is clearly a Pangrave cemetery. And although preservation was really poor, our work is shedding light on the lives of these ancient nomadic peoples and their relationship with ancient Egyptians. So yeah, thank you for paying attention. I'm just going to stop share. There we go, so I can see everybody.
Wow. Well, thank you. That was terrific. I had one question. I mean, do we know if these were graves of ordinary people or special people? I mean, you talked about that woman possibly being a bead maker. That sounds quite artisan to me, not somebody fancy.
Yeah. So the thing is, we haven't excavated that many pan graves to really know the difference in status between folks. You know what I mean? Usually we would look at things, dietary differences and whatnot. And it's hard to know if the size of the superstructure, the tumulus, might be able to indicate status. Tomb 13, which is one of the other ones that I could have talked about today, the actual superstructure was gone, but the mud brick was present and it was massive. So it's potentially, the size of the superstructure, which is giving this away. And the problem is all these graves have been looted. So it's really difficult to determine, how much stuff was truly in the graves to then be able to determine, like, was this a status thing? And, in my courses, we talk about how just because you have a lot of stuff in your grave doesn't necessarily mean you have a lot of status, at the same time, right? Because it's the folks who are burying you, you know what I mean, or putting their best stuff inside. But yeah, it's unclear right now, unfortunately.
So the size of these graves, they were not particularly big then. They seem,
no,
they just look to be about a body size.
Exactly.
This massive thing that you imagine when you think of,
Yeah, and it's actually, some of these graves, not the pan graves, but some of the other kind of pre-dynastic graves that I've excavated at, it's kind of great because you go down, you find some sort of structure on the surface and it gives you an indication that something's there. And then you start excavating, and you start cleaning off the sand and you just kind of dust all the kind of Aeolian sand that's flying around. And then you hit some sort of substrate and then it's just hard rock. And then you just have to like sweep the sand away. And then you could be standing here inside the hole. And then all of a sudden you're excavating down and then they have side chambers. So you're excavating and then all the sand starts falling out of this side chamber and then the burial is placed within the side, which is great because you don't have to worry about standing on a person as you're excavating going down. Side chambers are the best. Yeah.
Does anybody have any other questions that they'd like to ask?
So I went to Egypt in '89.
Yeah.
And we went to the Temple of Kamumbo.
Yes.
And so, but this is on the other side of the river from that.
It's further down also. Do you know what I'm trying to say? The Temple of Kamumbo. Yeah, like did you see the so like
we went to Aswan too, and we went to Elephantine Island and all that, yeah.
And did you see like so the Temple of Kamumbo, there's a crocodile cult there. I don't know if so like I've been in their backstory.
Oh right, right. We toured the whole temple and learned all about the crocodiles.
Exactly, but there's thousands of crocodiles in their storage room, crocodile mummies. It's amazing, and there's fake mummies.
Missed that.
Yeah, they ran out of crocodiles to kill, to mummify, so they would make fake crocodile mummies, which is the best. So you have to X-ray them to see what's actually inside. Yeah. Anyways, I'm glad you went. Did you enjoy it?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it's an amazing country. Once you get over the level of poverty, it's an amazing country. But it's, as an American, it's just a shock to see the level of poverty. So, but so it's on these graves are on the other side of the river from Aswan and Kamumbo.
Yeah. So basically, I'll pull up a map. Usually that's the best way, right? 1 second here. Look at me working on a paper here. Okay, Aswan. Let's see here, the Temple of Komombo. Let me just zoom out, see if I can find it for you. Oh, it's so hard when you're in Zoom here. Everything's moving around and your pictures are all in the way. 1 sec. See if it'll pop up.
But well, we went to Aswan and we took a bus from Aswan back up to,
Yeah, exactly.
would have been
So
Luxor. And so it looked like most of the settlements were actually on the west side of the river.
we're in Aswan.
Yeah, down near Aswan and,
Okay, so yeah, in Aswan, everything's on the east bank. So this is never
oh, well,
east,
sorry.
yeah, so it's on the east bank, and where we're working is on the west bank. So this is Aswan proper, and Komombo's up further. So it's a little bit of a
Okay.
drop. Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, and I was also amazed at how narrow the habitable zone was before you went into a dune desert. It was
Mhm.
like a quarter of a mile, half a mile wide. And at the time, was the climate different? Was there a wider habitable zone in there?
Yeah, so it depends on the time period. Obviously, Neolithic would have been different. I'm not necessarily sure about where the Nile, well, I mean, where we're digging is in the alluvial, Pleistocene alluvial area, right? So at one point, all these graves are dug into ancient riverbeds that would have been offshoots off the Nile. I mean, the Nile's constantly moving. I mean, I don't know if did you get to experience a haboob? Like
A
a,
what?
it sounds like, I know it sounds like some weird sexual thing, but it's a haboob, which is a sandstorm. But anyway,
No, we missed that fun.
yeah, I remember we excavated this pre-dynastic site and we had dug out this 10 by 10. And by the time the haboob was over, it was filled in. Like, just to kind of give you an idea, the sand just kind of constantly moves and the river's moving too. But yeah, so definitely the area would have been different at the time, for sure. We're talking, 4,000 years ago, right?
So it would have been more like more lush, more arable, so they could have had more land to farm on either side or whatever these people
I'm not
did.
entirely sure. Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
Like, I'm not a paleo environmentalist, so I'm not entirely sure exactly what the climate was at that exact moment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, I mean, the small, tiny strip of arable land that Egypt has, and for them to build those massive civilizations over thousands of years and maintain it on this like mile wide strip is just pretty amazing when you think of all the land that we farm in America,
Exactly.
today. So,
Oh, great. Especially with like 60, even today, with millions of people living, 65 million people,
yeah.
Yeah. No,
And that was the other thing about Egypt. It was like living in Cairo was like walking on the streets in New York City on rush hour was like that 24 hours a day in Cairo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I always laughed about that. Like, you're never alone. Do you know what I mean? You could be in the middle of where you think you're in the middle of nowhere. There's someone there. But yes, it's an amazing place. Doug, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I remember when I was I think Dr. Abrams told me like just how terrible it was. Like, the Egyptian government was really bad with working with people. Is that true?
Oh, I mean, for myself, I don't necessarily have to, have contact. Are you talking about the antiquities officers? Are you talking about like getting permissions? Everything is just slow. Do you know what I mean? It's just the way it is. If you want to get permission, like security clearance, like at one point, once you've worked there many times, you know exactly what has to be done. You know how much time you have to give yourself. It's just like, accustoming yourself to another culture, right? It's like they have other things to worry about. You know what I mean? Than you getting your permit. But yeah, I've had trouble. You want to talk about dealing with governments. I've been in the process of immigrating into the United States to get a commuter green card for the last 3 years. So that, you want to talk about working with the US government. But yeah, I probably got more of a beef with them. But don't tell them. This is being recorded, right? No?
Yeah, your secret's safe for us, I guess. No, but she was saying though, like, like, did you ever have any experience like with the Egyptian government, like doing anything to try to stop you guys? Because she was telling us about how like they were just like super, super protective about all their artifacts and stuff.
Yeah, which I get, because folks outside of Egypt have been kind of pillaging, their entire country for the last, a couple hundred years plus. But yeah, no, like, I mean, we're not allowed to take anything out of the country. We recognize that. We know that. So at this point, you have to go back and you have to study things. If you forget to take a picture, you have to go back next year. That's just the way it is, and that's unfortunate. And, a lot of times too, I can't get radiocarbon dates, like I was mentioning. I can't do kind of state of the art studies. I can only do, classic bone pathology and whatnot. That's it. So that's limiting. Yeah. At the same time, kind of get it. Right. Yeah, that's what happens. Like the US might have laws, whatever, and then that sends folks to other countries that don't have laws. So Egypt has laws now. Right. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, Dr. Pitre, I'd like to thank you very much for doing this for us.
Yeah, no
And this is going to go out onto our YouTube channel, and I know that people are going to be watching it then. Yeah, wait until the cold, wet days of winter.
I totally get that.
I'm blown away. I'm delighted that you could do this for us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And
No,
thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
no problem. Thanks. Went okay.